If you want to start reading X-Men comics, you've come to the right place. Some months ago, I decided it was finally about time to start reading X-Men comics. Considering these characters have over 50 years worth of history behind them, that meant I needed to know where to start.
So I asked a few people I know who are avid X-Men fans, one of whom is Tom DeSanto, producer of the first two X-Men movies, who told me to start with Giant Size X-Men number 1, and then to read from there into Chris Claremont's run on the series. So naturally, I followed his instructions. Tracking reprints of these early Claremont X-Men comics was rough. There were omnibuses, but I wasn't able to find them at a reasonable price, being they were either out of print or wouldn't be printed for months.
Nevertheless, I managed. I picked up X-Men Epic Collection Volume 5, Second Genesis, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was a blast to read. Unfortunately, it doesn't include everything, and once it cut off, I found myself wanting more. Problem is, for some weird reason they don't print Epic Collections in order, like there's Volume 12, but Volume 6 still isn't out. And I really wanted to know what happened next, so that meant I had to find an alternative. So, I got Marvel Unlimited and read a bunch of issues digitally, all the way up into the Dark Phoenix saga, which you know I had to get physically.
Now, Claremont's run doesn't end there. Far from it, actually. In fact, Chris Claremont wrote X-Men for a whopping 16 years. With such a long run, people have been splitting it into different eras and sections. While there's no official way to split it up, I would consider the first era of Claremont's run, or as I call it, the Second Genesis era, from Giant Size X-Men number 1 to Uncanny X-Men number 138. Now, like others have helped me, I aim to help others interested in reading X-Men, perhaps you, in knowing where to start. In this video, I will run through these issues and give you my thoughts on them as well as some basic history and context behind them. You see, X-Men didn't start in Giant Size X-Men number 1, which was released in 1975. Rather, the X-Men first appeared in X-Men number 1 in 1963 by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. While you don't need to know everything before this point, here's a bit of a basics that you should know from this first era of X-Men history, aka the Silver Age. Some superhumans are just born with their powers. These people are known as mutants, and Professor Charles Xavier is one of them, a telepath crippled and bound to a wheelchair. Seeking a better world for mutants, Xavier founded a school for gifted youngsters, where he recruited 5 young mutant students who he trained in the use of their powers, gave a safe place where they can be themselves away from the mutant prejudice they face every day in society, and formed them into a team that fights to protect humanity from evil, especially other evil mutants. These 5 young students became the original X-Men and consist of Cyclops, aka Scott Summers, the field leader of the X-Men, Marvel Girl, aka Jean Grey, Beast, aka Hank McCoy, who had not yet become the blue furry beast that we know and love, instead just being a big, buff, and hairy guy with big monkey feet. But we'll get to that. Angel, aka Warren Worthington III, and Iceman, aka Bobby Drake. Their first mission was to fight Magneto, an old friend of Professor X who had since become an extreme mutant terrorist, fighting humans to assert his dominance over mankind and force them into submission. The X-Men put a stop to him, but the fight is far from over between them, even to this day. Over the years, there would be 2 other X-Men of note to join their ranks. Havoc, aka Alex Summers, the brother of Cyclops, and Polaris, Magneto's daughter, who had the same powers as him, just not as powerful.
Okay, quick side note. So in the issues I'm recommending to you, you're going to notice a couple of times that Polaris is going to say Magneto isn't her father. That's because she didn't know at the time, but just ignore that, because she is Magneto's daughter. Which she finds out, I guess, later. Yeah, I know it's stupid and it's overcomplicated and it's convoluted, but hey, welcome to the world of comic books. That kind of stuff happens all the time, especially with Magneto's children. By God, they're still going through crap like this in the current comics. It's ridiculous.
And then, the final roster change of note, Beast finally becomes the iconic blue furry version of himself we all know and love today. And then he quits the X-Men to join the Avengers. Don't worry, he'll be back though. Now, if you want to read something quick that gives you a bit of the backstory for the original team, I recommend reading X-Men Season 1, which I read for free with Amazon Prime digitally while waiting for my first Epic collection to arrive. Also, there's the X-Men Origins collection, which I also read afterward. It's not essential reading, but if you want to read some backstory of some characters, even ones that aren't in this reading, it's a fun read. Unfortunately, unlike the Fantastic Four, the Avengers, and Spider-Man, the X-Men weren't very popular during this period. As such, in 1970, the series stopped printing new stories altogether for almost 5 whole years, until finally making their comeback in 1975 with Giant Size X-Men number 1, written by Len Wein and drawn by Dave Cockrum, with a brand new international lineup. This story is responsible for introducing many of the most iconic and beloved X-Men we know and love to the team. Without going into too much detail, this story basically revolves around Professor X going around the world seeking new mutants to recruit and join the X-Men, forming a brand new team led once again by Cyclops to rescue all of the old X-Men from capture. Thus, the X-Men are reborn. These new X-Men include Nightcrawler, aka Kurt Wagner from Germany, Storm, aka Aurora Monroe from Kenya, Wolverine, aka James Logan Howlett from Canada, Colossus, aka Peter Rasputin from Russia, Banshee, aka Sean Cassidy from Ireland, Thunderbird, aka John Proudstar, a young Apache man from Arizona, and Sunfire, aka Shiro Yoshida from Japan. Giant Size X-Men number 1 changed everything, and is considered to be the first seminal moment in X-Men history, and is the perfect starting point for any new X-Men reader, and is just a great overall story. And believe it or not, my friends, it actually gets even better from here. Unfortunately, with 13 X-Men now, some had to leave the team, and that included most of the original lineup, barring Cyclops, who stayed on to lead this new team. Now, I don't want to go too in-depth on further plot details, as it's much more satisfying to read for yourself, but I will mention a few key moments and storylines within this era. The first major storyline is the Phoenix Saga. Not the Dark Phoenix Saga, that comes later, and yes, the two are very much related. In fact, if you plan on just reading the Dark Phoenix Saga without reading its predecessor or any of the other issues building up to it, you're really missing out on a lot of the build-up, and I advise against it, because I want you to have the best reading experience for that storyline as possible, like I did. While the Dark Phoenix Saga still stands strong on its own, the years of build-up through multiple storylines is a big part of what makes the Dark Phoenix Saga so great. But what if I told you that even the original Phoenix Saga had some build-up? Not as much, granted, but it's still necessary to read, and of course, is a solid X-Men story.
It is preceded by an, in my opinion, pretty underrated storyline that doesn't even have any real name. So I'm going to call it Project Armageddon. Boom! If anyone starts calling that Project Armageddon, I get credit for it. I mean, not the name Project Armageddon, because that's a project that they mention within the storyline, but more so the idea of them calling that storyline Project Armageddon. That's me. If they make that in graphic novel form, thank me for that. Or at the very least, if people start calling it that online, it started here, baby. Project Armageddon. That's me.
Anyway, this Project Armageddon is what kickstarts and leads directly into the first issue of the Phoenix Saga, which goes from issues 101 to 108. This story is pretty dang cool. It has the birth of Jean Grey as the Phoenix, Banshee's castle, the Juggernaut and Black Tom Cassidy, who, yes, is related to Sean Cassidy, aka Banshee. They're cousins. Magneto, and the X-Men even go into space at the end. They meet the Shi'ar Empire and a bunch of other cool space characters who will be important and revisited many times later. So yeah, this story is a must-read.
So there are a lot of fun stories between the Phoenix Saga and the Dark Phoenix Saga, but like I stated earlier, I'm not going to go through everything in between. But there is one storyline that's worth mentioning, and that's the Proteus Saga, which is a fan favorite and introduces fan favorite villain, Proteus. And immediately after the Proteus Saga, the Dark Phoenix Saga begins. The Dark Phoenix Saga is considered to be arguably the best X-Men storyline of all time, if not the best, and arguably one of the best comic book storylines of all time, if not the best. So yeah, it's a pretty big deal. And, you know, I was super excited to get to it, but I'm going to be honest, there was a bit of a sneaking fear in me. I thought, what if after all this time it doesn't live up? And look, I don't mean to add fuel to the flame here, but it totally lives up. The Dark Phoenix Saga blew me out of the water. It is utterly phenomenal. Seriously. It's worth all the hype. It is awesome. It is a fantastic storyline. And it's one of the best comic book storylines of all time. You have to read it. Read it. It really is that awesome.
As I said, it stands on its own as a great story and can be read as such, but I am glad I read everything beforehand, as not only was it worth reading, but it greatly enhanced the reading experience for this classic tale of epic proportions. The Dark Phoenix Saga is a tale that is galaxy-spanning and yet still deeply personal, character-driven, and grounded all at once. I have no intention of spoiling it for those that know nothing, and even if you know some spoilers, you may not know the whole context or how they come about. Regardless, there is no substitute for the Dark Phoenix Saga. It simply must be read to be truly experienced. What's not to love about this story? Nearly all of the X-Men up until that point at least make an appearance, even if some of them aren't in active roles. Except for Iceman for some reason. Yeah, it would have been nice to see Iceman here for this climactic event, especially since he was the only one of the original 5 not present, but ultimately that's just wish fulfillment. In addition to all of these old characters, we get introduced to a bunch of brand new ones right out of the gate, both heroes and villains alike. In the first issue alone, we are introduced to 2 iconic X-Men characters, Kitty Pryde and the White Queen of the Hellfire Club herself, Emma Frost. The following issue, we are introduced to Dazzler and the Black King of the Hellfire Club, Sebastian Shaw. This story is action-packed. However, to say that it is all action, just the climax, would be a great disservice. Like I said, the story stands on its own and is incredibly character-driven. We don't see the Dark Phoenix or journey into the cosmos for the majority of this story. Rather, this story builds to it. Jean Grey truly is the star of this story. The struggles, development, and changes she goes through as a character are truly spectacular. I don't know how anyone can walk away from the story and say she's a bad or boring character. Granted, I haven't read the 60s stuff, but Jean Grey is a real standout here, and proves to be an incredible character and an X-Man through and through. Thus, by the end of this story, you are left feeling highly emotional. The ending is truly heartbreaking. Perhaps tears begin to swell up in the reader's eyes, or maybe they even let loose. Regardless, you will feel something strong. When people say superhero stories are dumb action or a waste of time, I think to stories like this and know how wrong they are. The Dark Phoenix Saga is the pinnacle of comic book storytelling and a must-read for any X-Men fan or any comic book fan in general. While collected editions of the Dark Phoenix Saga have the story end in issue 137, I would argue that to truly finish and get the full story and resolution of the Dark Phoenix Saga, yes, the climactic double-sized final showdown takes place in issue 137, but the epilogue and resolution of the characters, namely Cyclops, takes place in the next issue, and thus I would deem it essential reading. Sure, it's mostly a recap issue, but by the end you'll understand why it's important, at least on an emotional and character level. And after all, isn't that what it's all about? If you don't have Marvel Unlimited or an omnibus but want to read this issue, no sweat. Turns out this Days of Future Past trade actually has more than just Days of Future Past in it. In fact, it has everything you need to read from the Dark Phoenix Saga all the way through Days of Future Past, and even containing one issue afterwards centering around Kitty, which also happens to be John Byrne's last issue on the book. Yes, that's right. Almost right after one of the most celebrated and iconic X-Men storylines of all time, the Dark Phoenix Saga, comes Days of Future Past, another one of the most celebrated and iconic X-Men storylines of all time, right around the corner, and yeah, it's pretty great. But I've gone on long enough. Those stories will have to wait for another time. Don't worry, there's plenty of great X-Men stories to cover, especially by Chris Claremont, and we're only just getting started. Until then, from Giant Size X-Men number 1 to X-Men 138, you know what to read.
If you have any questions, thoughts, or opinions of your own, be sure to leave them down below or contact me. I'd love to have this conversation and talk about this kind of stuff. If you have any video ideas or things you want me to talk about, please tell me. I'd love to. You know what? I've taken up enough of your time. It's been great, but you've got some comics to read. Anyway, guys, until next time, I've been your host, Vaughn Coleman. You've got some comics to read, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye!